Hi, and welcome back to Map the Maze. So thank you for joining me for the last of Tough Love. Today, I wanted to talk about something which I think is really difficult for people to accept when they're separating. That getting to the place where you're ready to separate is difficult. And often when I'm working with people, there's a lot of ambivalence about how they feel about the separation, whether they want it, whether they want to try and reconcile, if that's even possible. Although usually by the time people get to me, it's too late. Too many things have happened. Life has moved on. People have started to disengage, to distance emotionally so that they can prepare to be separate. One of the challenges that people often experience is that when people were in relationship, there were things that the other person did, whether that was about how they parented, how they managed issues with the children, how they dealt with things financially that the other person didn't like. And obviously that can be one of the many reasons why people decide to separate. Often when I'm working with people in mediation, there will be an instinct to say, well, say, for example, it's around parenting and children. They parent this way. I don't like it. So now going forward, I want it to be different. The challenge is this. Nobody comes to mediation and becomes a different person. Definitely, there is a silver lining, which I'm going to talk about at the end, but nobody changes because they've come through a mediation process. That fundamentally people will remain the same. And if the concern is around parenting, they're going to be a very similar type of parent to the one they were before. If you couldn't control somebody when you were in relationship and together, the chances of being able to control them when you separate are much lower. That you can put in place structures, and definitely we do that. And I think that is helpful for a lot of people. We can put in arrangements, we can introduce flexibility with notice, we can do all of that. And I think for some people that's enough, but definitely sometimes I meet people who think if we come to mediation, then the mediator will tell the other person to be reasonable, will make the other person be reasonable. And obviously, if I had those kind of powers, I wouldn't just be mediating with them. It doesn't happen. You can definitely, I think, expose people to different ideas. And so one silver lining, I would say, is that I worked with a couple who were separating. There was a lot of anger and a lot of bitterness for one of the parties. He had not chosen to end the relationship and he was not happy about what was happening. And it was really difficult for him to negotiate in the mediation because everything was said essentially through gritted teeth. He was so angry and so hurt by what had happened, by the relationship ending. 3 years later, they came back to see me. They did agree things. They put in place their arrangements. They even put in place co-parenting guidelines and communication guidelines. And this is kind of what was interesting for me. They came back 3 years later because one of the parents wanted to relocate with the children, which is generally one of the hardest things that we talk about in mediation, because as you'll appreciate, children are either in country A or they're in country B. They're not going to be in both at the same time. And so for most parents, this is a very binary outcome. The children are going to be in the same country as I am, or the children are not going to be in the same country as I am, for the parent who's remaining. And for the parent who wants to relocate, either I can move with my children, or I now face the choice of moving without my children or not moving. So relocation is really a tough discussion for any couple. So this couple came back and it was interesting. So I met them both for 15 minutes before the mediation started, just to get a quick update on where they were, because I'm familiar with their family situation. And whilst he was still very angry, what was interesting to me is as we started mediating, the way that he communicated had changed significantly, and maybe I think unconsciously for him. But instead of just responding with anger to proposals from the other side, he would acknowledge them. He would say, yes, I can understand that that is an option, and I can understand that these are the points. Let me clarify my understanding of these other 2 points. I understand your proposal, which was already a big shift from where he had been, because the last time I had seen him negotiate, he had really just said, no, absolutely no, it's a no. So the shift in how he responded to receiving proposals, totally different. The second aspect was his ability to make proposals was totally different, that he was able to say, this is what I think should happen. This is why I think it meets the children's needs, it meets your needs, it meets my needs. And that was, for me, really, I guess, validating as to why mediation is a process that's worth making the effort for, that people don't change fundamentally from who they are, but people can definitely upskill. And that even though that was not a stated goal of the mediation or of this particular person, he had internalized the communication guidelines that they had put in place. And even though he still did not agree with what they were talking about, he was able to understand, he was able to focus, he was able to negotiate, come up with options, make proposals that were much more developed, that were reasoned, that responded to what had been said by the other party. And I just remember being so impressed, really, by his ability to change and modify the way he interacted with the other person. It still made it difficult, didn't make it an easier conversation to have because the subject matter was so difficult, but it changed the quality of their conversation. And given that they have children, that they have children who are still minors for several years to come, knowing that actually, even if they don't agree, they will have a better conversation was a real positive for me. So that even though people don't fundamentally change, they can definitely upskill. The other thing I would say is that, again, even though people don't fundamentally change, what I do see is that people, when separation happens, particularly if they have children, and maybe if they haven't been very involved or very engaged with children prior to the separation, because maybe they're working a lot, maybe they have a lot of commitments, they come home, children are in bed, they can go and kiss the kids goodnight, they can be there in the morning when they have breakfast, wave them off to school. That for some parents, the fact that they are not physically in the same space as their children, that they're not on tap, so to speak, that they actually have to make efforts, can alter the quality of their parenting, in the sense that they may go from being someone who's disengaged to being someone who is involved. And so it's a silver lining, in a sense, because the separation can sometimes highlight for people, reveal to people how important their children really are to them. And that maybe before they just assumed, oh, the other parent will take care of it, the other parent will deal with it. Actually, if you want to be a parent, then maybe you need to shift how you're behaving, how you're interacting, how you're sharing the load. And I remember working with one couple in particular where we talked about their children's arrangements, we talked about the financial arrangements, they had essentially agreed everything. And there was some resistance, that the wife felt that the husband hadn't been as involved as he could have been in looking after the children. And he spontaneously, I mean, he had been told several times by her, I think, in the past, not in the mediation necessarily, but in the past, that he wasn't, from her perspective, pulling his weight. He came up with an agenda item, which was, I want to talk about how do we share the burden of raising the children. And it was really interesting because she then said, well, what does that mean? And he said, well, it's things like, from his perspective, he said, and I'm happy to hear what you say, but I think it's things like, you know, organizing dental appointments, sorting out school uniforms, getting the books done, getting the sports equipment ready, going down and paying for the school bus, sorting out the extracurriculars, getting them registered on the team for that semester. All of the administrative and sort of not fun tasks that are needed to keep a child running. And it opened up a whole conversation for them. It opened up an opportunity for her to express how she felt about how she felt she had been carrying that burden by herself. And he was able to express that whilst he may not have seen himself as not helping, he realized that there were things that he could step up and help with, and that actually maybe the two of them could share some of that workload. And I think it made a big difference in the mediation for both of them, that it was a signal that even if maybe to date it hadn't been great, and that actually the wife had been carrying more of that administrative burden for managing the children, and they both worked full time, these parties, that when they separated, actually there was going to be a sharing of that workload, which maybe hadn't happened in the relationship. So a silver lining that came not because somebody had fundamentally changed, they were still the same people, but the situation had changed. And the fact that they were separating, the fact of the physical separation, the fact that they were actually designing the roadmap for their parenting made a difference. It forced a reflection about, well, we haven't done it this way to date, but maybe, just maybe, we can do it better going forward. So tough love number 5 is there is no magic wand. I wish there was. People do not fundamentally change, that mediators can't make people reasonable, but the silver lining is that the process can teach people different skills, can give them different ideas about how to interact, which can be really beneficial. And it can also, the reality of the separation can prompt people to think for themselves, what does this change about how I want to live going forward? That, maybe today we haven't been able to do this, but now we should find a way to put in place these arrangements. So that's the last lesson. That's the last tough love. I have to say it's probably not the end of the tough love lessons I could give, but I think 5 lessons is probably enough for 2024. So next week, I will be joining you from a different locale, not just the office, which actually at the moment is super messy because mediation finished late last night. So not tidy. So thank you for watching. Thank you for staying with me. Hopefully you've watched all 5 of the Tough Love series. If you haven't, like and subscribe. And I will see you next week from a yet to be disclosed location. Okay. Thanks a lot. Take care.